Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. And these are the days. Boy, it's tough to keep up with everything that's going on in Richmond, but an evergreen as those who seek to get the ERA ratified look upon Virginia as one of the low-hanging fruit. Probably our statewide election results are a reason they feel like we would be the most likely of the remaining states that had not ratified the ERA to get it done, come after us every year in the General Assembly to get the Equal Rights Amendment ratified, and therefore finally finishing the amendment process. And joining us now from the Family Foundation is Victoria Cobb, because there's an interesting subtext for the ERA that I don't think a lot of people realize. Victoria, welcome back to the program. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
President of the Family Foundation, and a great piece that we're going to share with our social media followers as well at familyfoundation.org regarding something that is it intentional that the ERA would do this to churches and their tax-exempt status? Tell us what you found and why people need to be aware of this before their legislators vote for this.
Well, there's just so many things that are impacted when you go and put into the U.S. Constitution an equal rights amendment that requires this idea, and it's sort of a legal term, but it's called strict scrutiny, but in layman's terms, sort of looking at gender differences at the highest level the court can and saying only in very, very, very rare cases will we allow someone to treat genders differently. The fallout of that is a whole lot of things, and one of them is what do we do about churches that have a theology that have male leadership in either their clergy or their pulpit or however you want to describe it. The Catholic Church would fall into this, and there are many other Protestant denominations and maybe some other faiths, Muslim. I mean, there's just many places where that comes into play. And so the question becomes, what does the court do with that? And we have no reason to believe the court would treat it differently than the way that they look at race issues, and that's where we're trying to help people understand what this ERA does. If you think about it, in the same way that we say you can't discriminate based on race, we look at it and we look to things like Bob Jones University. If you remember that legal case, Bob Jones University was told it could not maintain its tax-exempt status and continue to treat the races differently. We would expect this would be the reasonable response of a court in a strict scrutiny situation created by the U.S. Constitution.
And I think this is important because the ERA has been floating around for so many years. People may be looking at it and not even really taking the time to read what's inside of it. Often debatable, and part of the reason it didn't get passed back when it first was presented is the idea that whether we applied it that way or not, the Constitution in its construct, as Martin Luther King pointed out, is the original Equal Rights Amendment if we just apply it properly, and adding an extra layer of judicial oversight to something just creating a protected class has all sorts of negative connotations and negative subtext, some of which we've seen borne out, as you mentioned, Victoria.
Well, we just have a lot of people who are trying to run a narrative that say this is purely symbolic, and the reason they're running that narrative is because the impact is very real when you add this to the Constitution and you change the way the courts and Congress are expected to look at the different genders. And so, the really important clause in this that people just want to ignore and want to not think about is that Section 2, and it says the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. That means that all of these issues where we determine that genders are different in some places, where women and men are distinguishable, unique in their own ways, all of those things will be turned over to the federal government. So Virginia, the state, our local communities, and our state government will no longer have the authority to say, hey, we think women-owned businesses ought to be treated preferentially. That's an example where people are used to that, but that gets turned over to Congress and then the court to interpret at a strict scrutiny level.
We see this in a lot of cases where, for example, broadcast radio ownership is much easier to get if you are a female-owned radio group, and there are plenty of mom and pops which are well, just mom, and pop works for mom because that helps them get their licensing. But it creates a legal sort of subculture where what really is going on isn't what's really going on. And it's kind of what happens whenever a government gets involved, Victoria, isn't it? Where we, the people, figure out a way to game that system anyway.
There's no question there are all across this Commonwealth businesses owned and operated by men that are in their wives' names for the special tax, sort of for the incentives that the state creates for that now that they have put those into place. And where there are women-owned businesses and they do get a leg up, that is a real question mark as to whether that could continue to happen. And then it seeps into every area. And what we've been trying to explain is that when this was originally debated and the deadline ran out in 1982, the extended deadline, we should say.
Yeah.
It was clear, it was sort of a commonly understood definition of sex. When you said that word, it meant men and women.
Oh, yeah.
We are in the 21st century, and I don't think our society, despite the fact that there's some things that we think are pretty basic at the Family Foundation, I don't think society has a commonly understood understanding of sex anymore. And so the courts are going to get to interpret that whole issue of are there even just men and women when we're looking at strict scrutiny. That's very complicated, and it is so the folks that are saying this is purely symbolic, it's just about time, women need to be recognized under the Constitution. They need to understand, first of all, women have been fully recognized in the 5th and the 14th Amendment and as applied by the courts, and that this is way more than symbolic. And if it were just symbolic, let's just go ahead and pass a resolution.
Right.
Not a ERA.
In a world where, I've seen some fanciful numbers where dozens upon dozens of supposed genders exist now, how do you even have an equal rights amendment if somebody can self-identify and actually have that? I think gender fluidity is considered recognizable in some Virginia schools where I could say I feel like a woman today, so I get to use the female facilities. I feel like a man the next day. Well, this creates all sorts of problems for something like the ERA, doesn't it?
It is really a new world that we're living in, despite the fact that some of us would say reality still exists and there's still biology. But it doesn't really matter anymore in so many cases what reality is. It's in the minds of the beholders and the liberal lawmakers. And this does, in fact, take those conversations that we've been having at a community and a state level, such as where do privacy rights for our daughters come into play? You know, how do we protect them in places where they expect to be able to be vulnerable, like a shower room or a locker room or one of these? You know, where are those limits? And those are conversations that are happening in schools, communities, and even at the state level in many states all over the country. And what the Equal Rights Amendment does is it ends that conversation, and it says that's in the hands of Congress and that's up to the courts to interpret. I don't think that's where we want those conversations to be happening. I mean, we've already seen in Virginia where, we have a teacher that was fired in West Point for refusing to use any pronouns in his classroom. He basically said, look, if we're going to have confusion over what is male and female, as a matter of his tenet of his faith, he didn't feel like he could deny what he believed was the reality that God had made, but he could just go pronoun-less.
Yeah.
For that, he was fired. And so that is what we could expect to see sort of at a congressional level upheld by federal courts. That's just not the place we want to be. And that's a lot of the complaint that folks who are opposed to the ERA have is this does not even use the word woman. This is not saying men and women are equal. If that's what we're intending to say and that's what people want, let's say that.
Yeah, exactly. As I said, if you and you can't deny that at the time in the 18th century, there were clear definitions, and you even got to the point where I believe technically, if you went as harshly as you could, the U.S. Constitution doesn't say gender; it just says property owners had the right to vote. So if you own property, you can vote. If you don't own property, if you really wanted to be tough about it, you could go back to the original interpretations and the original words of the Constitution, and then you might be able to scramble that all out there and just say, fine, gender has nothing to do with it. Do you own property or not? And then we'll decide from there if you get to vote.
Yeah, this creates a sort of catastrophic level confusion because it's not something we're doing. I mean, so many things that we talk about at the Family Foundation, in our legislature, these are things that are happening at the state level, right? So if you impact something, you're impacting it for our Commonwealth. In this case, we're telling Congress, do this at the U.S. constitutional level. We've had other folks say, oh, churches can't lose their tax-exempt status. We'll just fix it. I literally had a state senator say, we'll make sure that doesn't happen here in Virginia. And I looked at him and laughed because I would hope that our lawmakers understand that the U.S. Constitution trumps what we do at the state level. And you know, what you're doing is you're placing something in direct competition with the First Amendment that is that protection for our churches.
Let me ask you this, Victoria, on this subject. Now, my daughter goes to Virginia Commonwealth University, and their dormitories for their freshman class are segregated by male and female floors. What kind of dangers does this put at that? I mean, you mentioned the elementary school teacher that was fired just for not using pronouns at all. Considering some of the things we find out school teachers have been caught doing with their students, I certainly don't think firing somebody because he wouldn't use his or hers is the best use of our human resources.
No, and I think that community is rising up saying what is going on. You know, they had student walkouts, and I think they're backing this teacher strongly. But there are so many places like VCU dorms or like sports teams. I mean, you name it. There are places where we simply say we want either some separation, right? Like we either believe there's a place for men in this area for physical space, place for women, and that has a lot to do with privacy and vulnerability. And then there's places where we simply say men and women are biologically different. They are strength levels are different, all sorts of things, that we want them to compete against each other, not against, with women compete with women and men compete with men, and not have the situation that we're starting to see around the country where someone is let's say, in Alaska, they had, with the track situation at the state level, somebody had won statewide track meet twice, and then a female had won a female race, and then a male feels that he's a female, comes in and takes her title away the next year. That's the kind of thing that we can expect to see. We're seeing more of it anyway, but what's the unfortunate part about the ERA is that's now going to be decided in its entirety at the congressional level, interpreted by the courts, not a conversation for each state or each locality to have.
There was an interesting subtext. You bring it up when the subject of track and field. I was reading an interview with somebody who confessed that they had been told in preparation for an interview with Caitlyn Jenner that you were not to bring up Bruce Jenner at all. And then during the course of the interview, as has happened to me in many instances, the prepper had no idea. And in several instances, Caitlyn talked about Bruce Jenner, especially as it relates to the Olympics and accomplishments. So the interviewer said, I was told not to bring that up. And Caitlyn Jenner, I think very rightly said, well, Caitlyn Jenner didn't win those gold medals. Bruce Jenner did. They were male events, amongst other males, and I won those events. I couldn't go into the Olympics now and compete as a male because I'm not genetically that way. But, he seemed to be fairly clear on the question of even should he be allowed to compete against other females in this. And it's that kind of, sometimes it takes a moment of almost bracing clarity to say, well, duh, of course. But I think the political class is the one that's so inept to deal with these kind of issues. Well,
and I'll just be square, it's very difficult for the average person to navigate these things. These are not easy things to navigate. And I say that, and the example comes right out of that West Point teacher situation, where if you watch that trial where the teacher was on trial defending himself and his lack of use of pronouns, you actually had the administration, the administrator who was coming against him incorrectly call this student who is biologically female, who now thinks of themselves as a male, the administrator who was getting the teacher in trouble 3 different times referred to this student as a she. So used the wrong pronouns 3 times, but this teacher for not using pronouns got fired. And that's because it's hard to navigate, because in this case, people had known the student as a female the prior year and many years before that, and you're having to shift your lingo, shift your thinking, because in their minds, reality has shifted, even though we know the actual physical person has not changed. And all these things are just the complex issues our society is dealing with, which is fine. We will deal with them, but to elevate them to an unpopular body, if you think about congressional approval ratings right now,
well, yeah,
and their ability to get things done, to say we're going to turn over, and it's every sort of area where you're going to see gender come into play, family law, any place where we make distinctions. There's a reality that says actuaries treat women and men differently as they look at lifespans and insurance rates and all of those things, because there are biological differences. All of those things are getting turned over in this ERA to be determined and within the authority of the federal government. I don't send my state lawmakers to the state to turn their power over to my congressman. No. That is not what I think any Virginian does. And so for those who are trumpeting the narrative, and particularly the Republicans who are supporting the ERA, it's sort of been, this has been a plank of the Democrat Party for a while, but the Republicans who have kind of jumped on this train are in particular trying to say it is purely symbolic, because they know that the issue that the Republicans in particular have a tenet of sort of best government local, where you can vote people in and out the easiest is where you actually want most of your government. And so they know they're kind of flying in the face of their own party's principles.
Well, and I think some of it has to do with the elections of a couple of years ago, and some of these Republicans feel like their hold on their seat might be tenuous, so they're trying to find ways to pander. But, you mentioned just in your column at thefamilyfoundation.org, Victoria Cobb is on with us, that this is if it's just administered directly, ERA is passed, ERA becomes the law of the land, and then it goes to the courts. There's a whole other part of this, which is where the federal government and Congress decides to abdicate their authority, which they do time in and time out. See almost 99% of what the EPA does, where they just create an agency that deals with this, a bureaucracy that is even more incapable of dealing with this, and you'll wind up with bureaucrats doing this on an even more frightening and perhaps damaging to our society level, never mind just the legal ramifications, as you say, about churches and losing tax-exempt status.
Well, and if you talk to folks in the current president's administration, you will hear them say they are playing, quote, gender whack-a-mole. And what they mean by that is the Obama administration, their predecessor, had gone in every place they could in regulation. They had essentially sort of tried to degender that area of regulations. Well, it doesn't make sense. It isn't helpful. And so the Trump administration is trying to go back in and make some clarity between the sexes. And it's quite a task, because it's popped up in housing and in Department of Justice, in every area of law. So let's think about what happens when we start, sort of putting bureaucracies in charge of these fundamental questions.
Mm-hmm. Oh, without question. I think there's even on a deeper level, Victoria, and I don't want to muddy the water. And before we go, I want to make sure that people know how to contact their senator and delegate and let them know how you feel about it. But I think there's a darker backdrop to this of genericizing everything. The individual no longer matters. Who you are no longer matters. You're just citizen 48, and that really is a chilling Marxist view of the way we go, because it goes to equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity.
Absolutely, and part of what those who are opposing this ERA are trying to explain to folks that we celebrate womanhood. We believe that women are fully equal, have been given every opportunity, but we want to embrace that they are, in fact, unique and different. And what we share with folks is when in 1970s, when people were trying to figure this equal rights amendment out, there were issues, and they, I think, had this idea that equality required sameness. And I think it's really important for us to understand that we've long moved past this idea that for men and women to for example, have equal pay for equal work, that they need to be the same.
Right.
We understand that women have children, that women need maternity leave, that women, might want to work a more flexible hour, and they should just simply be presented with the same opportunities, and they're going to make some different choices.
Mm-hmm.
And we want a society that embraces all of that. We don't want this idea of sameness wrapped up into how it is that we embrace equality.
Yeah, absolutely, Victoria. So now, what is the best course of action? Obviously, I think our listening audience is one of the most connected out there. Should they be calling their delegates? I know in Roanoke, I don't know where Chris Hurst falls on it. I know his agenda has been decidedly against the firearm, but maybe Chris Hurst, is right on this. Maybe, it doesn't have to be Republican or Democrat. Should they just be calling their offices? What is the expectation on a vote on this if it comes forward?
Yep. So let me give you where we are exactly in the process. The Senate Privileges and Elections Committee has unfortunately moved it to the full floor of the Senate. We expect a full floor vote from the Senate today. Painfully, we expect it to pass the Senate because it has basically been embraced by all the Democrats, I believe, and we know that there were 3 Republicans that were part of making this pass out of that committee, 2 that voted for it, 1 that was co-patroning it or sponsoring the bill. So we expect it to pass out of the Senate. So the stop is going to be in the House. It starts in the House Privileges and Elections Committee. My encouragement to folks is not only call your own delegate, which is really important. They need to hear from you, but also to focus in on the House Privileges and Elections Committee. And people can get all that information on the virginiageneralassembly.gov website, just virginiageneralassembly.gov. Go look up House committees, look for Privileges and Elections, and you'll see the names of the members. Those folks are under tremendous pressure. They're hearing from people that support the ERA, not only from their district, not only from across Virginia, but nationwide, because this is one of the few things that impacts the nation. And so we don't want people to be hesitant in calling members that aren't their members. Normally we say just call your own member, but this Privileges and Elections Committee is being bombarded by the other side. So we encourage folks, look at that list, grab those emails, grab those phone numbers, and make a call.
Well, I know that several of the members are very good. There are some that I see as concerning, like Chris Jones and Mark Cole, who have shown capitulatory views. But then there are some like John McGuire and Steve Landis who have been very strong on the clarity of this. So there are certainly those who you can get with. We'll post a link to the Privileges and Elections Committee as soon as we can to our social media as well. Victoria, thank you again. It's familyfoundation.org, and we'll put the column up with this as well so that people can read it and then go forward with it. But if anything is this takeaway from this, it's that the equal rights isn't about equal or rights either, for that matter. But there are a lot of subtext, as with anything a government does, unintended consequences. And I thank you for bringing it to everyone's attention this week.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back with our Director of Legislative Information and Affairs from Tertium Quids, Caleb Taylor, on healthcare and telemedicine, coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Joining us now to talk a little bit more about what's going on at the Virginia General Assembly is Legislative Coordinator for Tertium Quids, Caleb Taylor. Caleb, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me back, Joe.
Not at all. So what exactly is a healthcare basket, and is it really a basket, or is it just a bunch of legislation that they want to call something fanciful to make us feel like it's friendly?
Well, it's the healthcare basket kind of came from the idea after Medicaid had passed or gotten through the budget process last year. Mm-hmm. A number of organizations sat down and began having a conversation on what the effects of that expansion were actually going to be in kind of a healthcare economic sense. And what are ways that some of those effects can be can be addressed.
I just want to point out that this is the kind of stuff that, generally speaking, we would have liked them to have done before they expanded Medicaid. But
agreed. This would have been the hope. A number of organizations sit down. What came out of it, and this actually started with the research done by the HOPE program,
okay,
as the Healthcare Openness and Access Program out of the Mercatus Center, with Robert Grayboys, who I believe that you've spoken to before.
Oh yeah,
and it's based off of just kind of a very simple economic principle that he talks about quite a lot, that Medicaid in and of itself expands demand but does nothing for supply. And for anybody that's taken Economics 101, when demand increases but supply doesn't change, prices increase for everyone.
And we've seen that already in the first year since the Medicaid expansion. Service has gotten worse and the cost has gone up. That's
right. And for us in the economics field, service getting worse isn't itself a cost. It's just it's a decrease of service for all intents and purposes, but it amounts to the same thing. You're getting less for the same amount of money. Might as well be the same thing as getting the same for more amount of money.
Okay.
But so what it comes down to is we kind of sat down and we came up with a number of different ideas as to what could help address supply. So there are a number of initiatives right now, an expansion of attempting to expand telemedicine, expanding the use of short-term healthcare plans, as well as what are referred to as renewal guarantees, opening up the use of purchasing insurance across state borders and across territorial borders.
Okay.
And association health plans and a number of others. And some of these are really exciting. The telemedicine bill this year has gotten a lot of, let's say, a lot of attention, positive and negative, from the General Assembly.
Mixed bag. It's bipartisan. Bipartisan, as they say there. Well, let's jump in first on the telemedicine because, just with Consumer Electronics Show wrapping up and a lot of technology questions goes into telemedicine. And we're not talking about the fanciful sort of being able to do a surgery from a remote location, but just being able to access a doctor via, simple systems by which we can call into overnight radio shows through Skype. We can talk to a doctor without having to sit in their office. Is that what I'm grasping from the telemedicine services bills? HB, I think it's 1970, right?
Yes, and yes, that's essentially what it is, and even more so to a point. There, the technology available today with 4K high definition streaming allows doctors. You could take your iPhone and point the camera down your throat, and a doctor is able to tell if you have strep. They're so high definition. But beyond that, there's also what's called remote patient monitoring. And currently in the state of Virginia, remote patient monitoring is only allowed for glucose levels in diabetes 1 and diabetes 2.
Okay.
However, we have the technology available to check an EKG through a very simple $100 addition to your phone, where you can give yourself an EKG very, very easily, and it's automatically sent to your cardiologist.
Oh, I've seen TV ads for these kind of apps and stuff. I mean, this isn't even sci-fi.
No, it's not at all, and it works amazingly. I myself have in the past had some minor heart issues, and I use this myself to contact with my cardiologist, and I'm fine.
Actually sort of bringing back the old country doctor of the days of yore, where you just have a GP in some small town in Southside Virginia that is able to maybe tap into the knowledge base at Carillion or VCU Health or wherever they're affiliated with via an internet connection, correct?
You're absolutely right. This actually opens the door to all of those types of applications. I also, when I do hear the poor don't have smartphones comment, I always find that funny, because smartphones are kind of the number one thing almost everybody in the nation has.
And didn't Obama give us all smartphones at one point?
Yes, I'm pretty sure that happened as well. But so it's one of the most widely used pieces of equipment out there. It's one of the great successes of kind of the market economy is the expansion of a computer in your pocket.
Yeah.
And most people also have computers or access to a computer as well. But the real important thing about telemedicine is that more than anyone else in the state, telemedicine will help the poorer regions, the rural regions, the inner city urban regions who are already suffering from a dearth of doctors. Or a dearth of medical services just in general. That's one of the whole points of this.
Right.
One of the reasons that these prices are increasing is because the poor are coming out of the woodwork, getting put on Medicaid expansion, on the expanded Medicaid. Fine. That was the whole purpose of them expanding it.
Right.
But
we don't have
a lot
more
more
doctors
than they imagined. Prices are increasing. And prices aren't just increasing for your average Joe, so to speak, that needs to go to the doctor. And it's not just increasing for the average poor Virginian that needs to go to the doctor. It's actually increasing for the government as well, because the government, being the one who pays for Medicaid, is a consumer of medical services. So each and every service that is being used by the government itself is increasing in price, further increasing the cost of Medicaid.
Right. So what is the reaction to these telemedicine bills? I see that they've been referred to a committee on committees. I guess it's the Health, Welfare, and Institutions Committee in the House anyway. Is there a hope that we'll get a written vote and not just the voice vote, pocket veto addressment to this?
Well, actually, we've gotten a lot more support than I imagined, not just from the Republican Party, but from the Democrat Party as well.
Good. I love that.
Yes, they're excited about it. Everyone knows that. Everyone recognizes the cost issues with Medicaid. Some people are okay with it. Some people are not okay with it. But everyone realizes it.
Well, that's good. I take back everything I said.
No, well, don't go too far.
Okay, right.
We're still, running into your standard special interest groups, doctors associations that don't want to have to compete with out-of-state doctors. What the telemedicine bill effectively does is it opens the door to doctors anywhere in the 50 states to engage in telemedicine. In Virginia.
Yeah. Well, and I just find it fascinating that even when we come back to our old favorite sawhorse of the certificate of need regulations, they really do seemingly have their cake and eat it too, because they lobbied and supported and managed to break away enough Republicans to expand Medicaid. Then you use that almost as if it's a complaint at the country club. I have to do this. Meanwhile, they're the ones who lobbied for it. It's amazing to me. And then they say, well, we don't want to get more doctors in here because I guess it cuts in on the kickback or the payoff. And
effectively, that's what's going on. But I mean, that's a hard portion of a very unfortunate portion of our political process, just as a whole. And the question is what can we do to kind of drive past this? At some point, both the hospitals and the doctors are going to have to recognize that we have only two directions to go in the healthcare system. Mm-hmm. One of those is universal healthcare. And in a universal healthcare system, if anybody's been involved in or read up on the one in Canada or in Britain, the doctors for all effects and purposes, are slaves to the system. How much they're paid is dictated by regulators. How much they work is dictated by regulators. Who they are allowed to help and who they are not allowed to help is dictated by regulators. And that's the direction that the country has been moving. The other option is these innovations like telemedicine, like direct primary care, which I firmly believe is the future of medicine in the United States. In my naive optimism.
It's also and I want to get into that, but here's the thing that I watch as we become more the regulatory state, more of the bureaucracy is going to fix it. It's almost as if we, the people, want to get our yellow vests out, because whether it's the law enforcement community and soon to be, and I've said this in the past, when the police arrest somebody's nephew and they don't like it, they protest and they march on the police station now. What's going to happen when somebody's abuela doesn't get the health care they think they should get, or they get told, I'm sorry, she's 86, we're just going to hospice her because we're not, she doesn't pass the advisability of care panel, as Paul Krugman called it. Are we going to march on our hospitals now, too? We're almost as if we're establishing the need for everything has to have a protest march attached to it.
You're absolutely right. As soon as a market, especially a market as large and important as the healthcare market, becomes a part of the political process, then the only way for you to get any action is to become a part of the political process. I find it completely inappropriate. The political process is not the cleanest and most efficient way to handle literally anything. At least in the market process, if a doctor won't handle your abuela's case, you go to another doctor. In a universal healthcare system, you don't have that option.
Right.
The healthcare system as a whole, the doctor has no choice. The healthcare system as a whole makes that determination for you. And if their determination is, well, your grandmother, it's just not worth it.
And that's what
Paul out of luck.
Paul Krugman admitted, I wouldn't call them death panels, but we'll call them, advisability of care panels. Caleb Taylor, Tertium Quids, legislative liaison expert. Tell us about where we are. I was excited when, Terry McAuliffe, of all things, signed the Direct Primary Care Association bill into law. Steve Landis, bill patron. But it hasn't happened yet, and you've got a bill that we've pushing here that would push this agenda forward. Where is it stalled?
It's not stalled. It's actually sitting in committee. We're talking with committee, and it actually looks a pretty good direction right now. Everything is moving very, very quickly, and they're trying to get things. There's something like 2,500 bills, and they only have until the end of March to handle them.
Right.
So they're trying to kind of rush through it. Our direct primary care is in the long term aimed at actually federal issue. The direct primary care bill actually it just forms a study to get us some data. Now, the purpose of this data is to affect change at the federal level, because right now, direct primary care in part is being held back by the IRS code.
Okay.
Yeah, so the state of Virginia recognizes that direct primary care contracts are not insurance, but the IRS code does not recognize that. And because it does not recognize that, it will not allow you to pay for a direct primary care contract through your HSA.
I see.
This is a major problem. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop statewide data on the cost effectiveness and the positive returns on direct primary care. And what we're hoping in the long term is to be able to use that as leverage to get a bill from Congress at the federal level, which will fundamentally change this portion of the IRS code that keeps HSAs from being able to be used for DPC purposes.
Yeah, because I think that's the win-win. HSAs, changing the way our HSAs are managed so that we can keep them for our lives and not have to disperse them until we need to. And it's amazing, Caleb, you and I have talked about this before. The fixes are so simple. It's like my puzzlement with Brexit. Okay, just stop being a member. Bring everyone home. Why do we have to have a plan, a deal? It's like Heath Ledger. Everybody has a plan. This bureaucratic power that they've gotten from Congress has to be reined in.
I think you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, that is a kind of a really, really broad question in terms of political incentives. No matter what organization or what you call it, whatever organization is collecting the money that the rest of the government is going to run off of is going to demand some type of political power.
Right.
The question is how do you rein that in? And there are, we've got writings as far back as Cicero, discussing that. So this is kind of a long-term human civilization problem we're dealing with.
Well, what about some of the court proceedings? I think the Supreme Court is hearing a case that would actually require, the regulatory state to actually have congressional law that dictates and rein back in this sort of broad brushstroke that they've had since, I think, the 90s to just sort of be told we want the Chesapeake Bay cleaned up and the EPA, you can fill in the blanks. I believe there's a Supreme Court case that we've discussed on this program. I'm just not remembering it off the top of my head. That's trying to rule on whether or not those agencies can just fill in the blanks without an actual elected member of Congress putting their name on it.
That would be a really great move in the right direction. And this is not something that I'm not a big fan of the kind of the regulatory layer that stands between us and the elected portion of the government.
Amen.
I've never been a big fan of it. I understand the purpose of it. However, it seems to me, and as we look through, America's relatively short history, especially of the legislative branch, it seems to me that the legislature, every new Congress finds a new way to give their power away. It's funny because I've been, just on a personal level, just for me, I've been reading the Federalist Papers, and I feel like John Jay and Madison and Hamilton would just be flabbergasted that anybody would be willing to do that.
Well,
you're going to give power away for political expediency? That doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, I think Madison and probably George Mason really grasped this, which is why they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the way they did, because I think they really truly didn't trust human nature, and that the more people got together in one room, the more likely that was going to be a bad thing for the rest of the people not in the room, which is why they wrote such a restrictive document that President Obama complained about so much, Caleb. But so, what is your feel, quickly before we run out of time, of the way this General Assembly is going? Tightly mixed, 21-19, 51-49. Split, but yet it seems like it's going pretty much the way General Assemblies have gone in the past since the Republican majority. What is your sense?
I would agree with you. It is kind of a mixed bag. There's a lot of strange moderacy going on. In the House they defeated the minimum wage bill, but in the Senate they passed it. We'll see how that's going to go. I can't imagine. I still don't understand why anybody would want to expand minimum wage. It just doesn't make any sense.
Especially if you're a Republican and you're going to. Yeah, I get that you want to run for re-election. Is the Senate passing a lot of these things in the ERA ratification, which they've been doing since 2011, passed again? But is it just sort of knowing that the House still has the voice vote, pocket veto that we can kill something without actually being seen as killing it? So the wink and the nudge is the Senate will vote for things and then they'll just vanish when they get into the House. And I don't know how long we can count on that continuing, Caleb.
I think that kind of attitude is going to continue forever. If the Democrats take over in the next election, they'll do it too.
Okay.
Anything that might be popular with a small portion of their electorate, but unpopular with the massive middle. They'll do the same thing. Oh yeah, we voted for it, but then it died by voice vote in the other house.
Yeah,
that's just kind of the nature of the game there. And so some of this will die. Both good and bad bills will die that way.
Mm-hmm.
The amusing thing is that several years ago, it was the Senate where all good bills went to die. Now it seems to be the House.
Somebody finds a way to do it. It
kind of fluctuates.
Legislative euthanasia. Yeah, but I guess it's truth, the axiom, the government that governs the least governs the best. So don't complain so much if the government's not doing anything. So with that in mind, though, we're out of time. Caleb Taylor, and I appreciate your visit again with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. He is the legislative coordinator for Tertium Quids and some of the healthcare issues we're working on. Go to tertiumquids.org, join in, get the newsletter, find out because there's action alerts on there that gives you phone numbers and email addresses so you can buttonhole some of these folks about it. And I do appreciate it, sir, and you have a great weekend.
You as well.
Thank you for listening this week. And for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. This is Freedom and Prosperity Radio. So long, and thanks for all the fish.